This is a lecture recap for our lecture on power. Today, during our lecture, we're going to look at various definitions of power, and we're going to distinguish between two types of power, hard and soft power. And we're going to look at various uses of hard power, paying particular to the Trident nuclear power program in the United Kingdom. In international relations, you can see two types of power. Behavioral power, which is the ability to obtain the outcomes that you want, and resource power, so the possession of resources that are usually associated with the ability to reach outcomes that you want. Today, in international relations, we're going to be specifically looking at the ability of one state to exert influence or control over the actions of another state. And within this definition in class, we excavated the idea or the coercive element within this definition. We can divide behavioral power into two types, hard power and soft power. And today we spent the bulk of our time talking about hard power. Hard power is the ability to get others to do what they otherwise would not do through threats or rewards. You can either use economic carrots or military sticks to do this. But the central idea underlying this definition is coercion. Individuals are not so much as asked, but are told what they need to do. According to Robert Keohane, hard power is defined as the ability of the less vulnerable to manipulate or escape the constraints of an interdependent relationship at low cost of an important source of power. And in class today we spent a lot of time looking at this idea of what it is to be vulnerable and using that in relationship to coercion. Now, military power tends to be the traditional focus of international relations, especially within realist and neo-realist approaches to the world. So with that awareness, we can then go on to say that one of the key functions of the state is to provide protection and security for its citizens. It also has a representative role in as much as it represents citizens at the international level and their national interests. But when we're talking about the state and military power, we must be aware of what type of order in the world we are working on. And so with that in mind, we started looking at what it was to live in a bipolar world and to understand the concept of balancing power in the context of these definitions of power. So to start with, we looked at the idea that balancing requires an equilibrium of military power between real or potential opponents. And then we went on to tie this to the main example of a bipolar world, and that is the Cold War between the United States and the former Soviet Union. We contrasted this approach to understanding world order with multipolar and unipolar versions of the war. And we talked about why these are important when we're talking about how we balance power. And I invoked two particular examples in the lecture, the SALT Treaty and the START treaties that were negotiated by Ronald Reagan and President Gorbachev towards the end of the Cold War in terms of a reduction of nuclear stockpiles. After looking at balance of power, we did go on to look at alliances. And I suggested that an alliance is an agreement between two or more states to work together on mutual security issues. We then went on to talk about what the value of an alliance would be, and we talked about that in the context of cooperative security. We said that states enter into alliances and these types of arrangements in order to protect themselves against a common threat, and that threat could be real or it could be perceived. Alliances are important because they allow you to pool resources. And when you pool resources, you can act together. And this in turn helps various groupings of states to improve their power position in the international system. We then went on to talk about the definition of alliances offered by Mearsheimer in 1990. And he writes that without the Soviet threat or an American night watchman, Western European states will do what they did for centuries before the onset of the Cold War. Look upon another with suspicion. Cooperation in this new order will be more difficult than it was during the Cold War. Conflict will be more likely. And we talked about that in the context of changing world orders and what happened in the early and late 1990s. With this in mind, we then returned to the idea of balancing power, and we talked about a nuclear deterrent strategy. And we talked about that both broadly in terms of the underlying principles, but also what that means specifically for the United Kingdom. We talked about nuclear deterrence, talking about mutually assured destruction, and the idea of city swapping. I then went over the Trident program in the United Kingdom, talking about how the the program actually work, and the fact that there is a submarine out to sea 24 hours a day to deter people from actually attacking the United Kingdom with nuclear weapons. We went over a brief version of it, when it started, how it came to be, what the current system is, and where we go into the future. This picture was offered by way of an illustration of the range of a missile that could be launched from a nuclear active submarine. And we talked about that and what that meant for security and insecurity, both within the United Kingdom but also in the world. And we had a very long discussion in class about what it was to make a rational decision and whether or not nuclear weapons are a rash choice in the current political climate. Nuclear security then works on the notion of balancing, and that is achieved by two states having one or more nuclear weapons that actually will guarantee to destroy an opponent if they launch a nuclear weapon. And this concept was discussed and given the name of mutually assured destruction. And that it is twinned with the idea of city swapping in order to establish the fact that if individuals or if a state is attacked, then there is a very good chance that there will be a retaliation, and that survival odds of either state is actually quite minimal. And we did have a very long discussion, as I said, about what the underlying assumptions of rationality is and what your end goals are, because within the class today there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not using nuclear weapons is actually a logical choice. But then we had a discussion about how are things changing, and are nuclear weapons and a nuclear deterrent based on balancing a suitable way to go forward. We talked about the fact that even though military power still dominates concepts of power at the theoretical and international relations, soft power is becoming increasingly significant, and so is the changing nature of war itself. In order to interrogate what the changing nature of war was and what impact this had on balancing, we talked about Donald Snow's book, Distant Thunder, that was published in 1996. And he makes the claim that there's something called new internal wars, and that these are less principled in political terms and more focused on the attainment of political ideals. And because of this calls into question the underlying idea as to why nuclear weapons and a nuclear deterrent strategy was developed in the first place. In a similar fashion, Mary Kaldor wrote in 2001 that interstate wars have declined in relative number to civil wars, and that the type of violence we're seeing is emerging along sectarian and identity lines, and not necessarily the old-fashioned war between states, again calling into question whether or not a nuclear deterrent strategy is effective or suitable, a thought that was echoed in our class discussions. It was at this point that we drew the lecture to a close and began talking about our assignments for the upcoming week. So I will leave the slides on soft power for you to go through at your leisure.